sort of expected that you'll have a moment of reflection after you think you've just narrowly escaped death. And mine came in the pilot's chair of a small aircraft just a couple of months ago. I just tried to land at a small airport nearby here, and I screwed it up. I flared too high, and when you do that, the plane comes down like a rock onto the runway, and then it bounces, and then it bounces again, and it bounces again. And when that happens, and it does happen, you're supposed to just hit the gas and get out of there. You're supposed to go around and try again. I'm a journalism professor. I'm not a pilot, never thought I would be a pilot. I thought I was going to be flying little robots on the ground, and I thought I was going to be teaching students about that. But the FAA told me that if I wanted to do that, I had to learn how to fly an airplane. So there I was. So what did I do in that moment? I kind of panicked. I pulled up too hard, I did everything wrong, and I listened in horror as the tail of the airplane scraped on the ground. And I may have, in a very undignified and unmanly way, said, "Help me, help me, help me, help me," to my flight instructor. Seconds later, we're gaining altitude and getting out of there, and I've got sweat pouring down my face, and I'm breathing hard, and my flight instructor is laughing at me. She said it wasn't that bad, really, but that didn't stop me from thinking, what am I doing here? And you might be wondering, what does flying a small airplane have to do with flying drones? And the answer is very, very little. But in this country right now, if you want to fly a drone for your job, the FAA expects you to have a pilot's license. And since they don't have a drone pilot's license to give you, that means you have to learn how to fly a manned aircraft. And that's what I did all summer long. It cost me about $7,000 in about 4 months, but I'm now a licensed pilot. I want you to see this clearly, so I'm going to demonstrate. This is what I'm talking about here. This is a DJI Phantom 2. They're one of the most popular models in the world, weighs about 3 pounds, flies for about 15 minutes, runs on a battery, can carry a camera gimbal and a GoPro, and you can get really, really cool shots from the air with them. This, that just took a dive into the case. Come back out here. This is a toy. This is a teeny drone. Costs about $40. But if I was outside right now in open air, where the FAA asserts jurisdiction, I would have to be a licensed pilot in order to do this. Anybody afraid of the big bad drone right now? So to be clear, my 9-year-old son, I bought him one of these for his birthday. He doesn't need to be a licensed pilot in order to fly this. And if you have a friend who has one of these, they don't either. But the FAA says if you want to do it for your job, and I'm on the clock for the university right now, got to be a licensed pilot. And they don't teach you that at flight school. Now, as silly as this all is, I think that these devices, well, hold on. I think these devices have a big role to play in our future. Workers of all kinds in the very near future are going to use these. Industries like agriculture and construction and wildlife management and pizza delivery, all going to be changed by drones. As a journalism professor, I lay awake at night thinking, what can I teach my students that's going to give them an edge in this world? And I think it's pretty obvious that a flying camera would be really useful to somebody who had to describe how big something is or how far something goes. I think journalists with small drones are going to change the way we see our communities. They're going to help us understand natural disasters or environmental change in much different ways. All kinds of workers are going to have a flying robot for their jobs very, very soon. But right now, we're at the beginning of the drone story. And there's a great line from an 80s sci-fi movie that said, "A beginning is a very delicate time." And a lot of the headlines that you read right now about drones are actually kind of scary. You know, near misses and crashes and flying trespassers. But understand this. The very same headlines were written in the decades after the Wright brothers took off from Kitty Hawk in 1903. And the very same mistakes that our ancestors made, we are trying very, very hard to make them right now. We shouldn't do that. We have to learn a lesson. And with disruptive technology, we keep having to learn this lesson. And it really doesn't matter what the technology is, the lesson remains the same. It's always about finding a balance between what we want as a society and what technology does for us. Each time we take our principles and we square them to a new reality. Now, our ancestors didn't get this right the first time either. I mean, these people thought that your face would fly off if you got onto a train going faster than 50 miles an hour. When the first consumer cameras came out, everybody freaked out and thought that all of public life was forever destroyed because people could take pictures now on a street at any time and you wouldn't know it. Can you imagine that in today's selfie culture? And really, if you think about it, making me learn how to fly an airplane, if you think about that and you think about me flying an airplane, it doesn't sound so weird anymore. But if we look back at our history and we really look at it, we'll see that there's a lot of lessons that we can learn about drones from what our ancestors did. Worried about flying things over your property? So were Parisians in 1783, when the first very brave soul got onto a hot air balloon and went for a ride. And besides all of the wonder at somebody flying through the skies, that moment completely changed our conception of property at that time. From the Romans until then, and even beyond that, we believed he who owns the land owns the skies to the heavens above. And it wasn't for about another 150 years or so that we realized, no, actually the skies belong to all of us. But the reason that you don't have airplanes buzzing right over your rooftops right now has less to do with property and more to do with noise and nuisance. In the 1940s, the Army Air Corps was buying up runways all over the country for the war effort. And they bought one right next to a chicken farm in North Carolina and began landing bombers on it day and night about 80 feet above their house. The chickens flipped out, actually died. The chicken farm went out of business, and the farmers sued the federal government. And the Supreme Court said that, yeah, actually doing that amounted to a taking, that the noise drove them out of business, and it was clear that it was the actions of this person that did it. And in that moment, the national airspace was born, and regulation of it came soon thereafter. The reason you're not going to have drones buzzing low over your house is going to do more with noise than it will with property. It's about finding a balance here between nuisance and technological innovation. It's about finding a balance between what we want as landowners and what we need as a society. In the years after the Wright brothers, cities and states started passing their own aviation regulations because there were none. Actually, the federal government didn't want the job originally. If you were brave enough to get on a flying machine, you could pretty much go where you wanted and do what you wanted for a time. And so cities and states stepped in. But what that created was this sort of nightmare scenario where if you wanted to fly from one place to another, you might need 2 different pilot's licenses, and the rules would change at some invisible point along the way. Imagine driving to Iowa and needing to have a Nebraska and a Iowa driver's license, and when you cross the river, suddenly the rules all changed. Well, that's what it was like for pilots for decades. We are trying to do the exact same thing right now. The FAA has not stepped in, has not passed drone-specific laws, although they're coming, but they're a few years away yet. And cities and states are stepping in. And actually, many of them are talking about banning drones altogether. Could you imagine if we had done that with manned aviation, how different our lives would be right now? It actually took our ancestors decades to sort this mess out, and it took a whole lot of lawyers. We're looking to do the same thing. I don't think it will take long, but it will take a lot of lawyers. But again, the balance here now is between safe constraints and technological innovation. It's between the freedom to utilize a new technology and rules of the road. When we talk about drones, a lot of people ask me about their backyard. They're afraid that drones are going to fly over their backyard and take pictures of them. And what I tell them is, the first pilots, people worried about them taking a little looky-loo while they're up there too. Suddenly our backyards weren't so secret anymore. And I asked people, what about this is different? I said, and also, I can see your backyard on Google Maps at any time. You do realize that, right? But what this presents is this kind of chunky stew mix of things. It is this things that we've seen on the news, and we've all seen too many movies, and there's just sort of a general discomfort with being watched. But it took 80 years after the Wright brothers for the Supreme Court to decide whether or not a photograph taken from an airplane was protected by the First Amendment. And what the Supreme Court decided was that the skies are like a public street. That's important because you can walk outside right now and take a selfie on the street right outside here and no one's going to say anything to you because it's protected speech. The Supreme Court said the skies are the same thing, but they said that street begins where airplanes fly. And right now the minimum altitude is 500 feet. So if you can see it from above 500 feet, it's public. Drones fly lower. They have to. We're trying to keep them out of the same airspace as other airplanes, so they fly lower. So they present a different problem. But the question remains the same. If the skies belong to all of us, and it is a public street, where does that street begin? And the balance here is between privacy and free speech. It's between expression and what we want as a society. Now, don't get me wrong, we're gonna screw this up. People make bad decisions. Legislatures pass bad laws. Ideas that seem like a good idea at the time, really not, like, say, making a journalism professor fly an airplane, not to be specific. But disruptive technology has a way of making us uncomfortable before it becomes part of our daily lives. And drones are going to be no different. Our ancestors, when they were faced with manned aviation, they screwed it up too. But they came to find a balance. And if we look at our history, and we look at what they did, and we try to look for this balance, we'll find it too. Thank you.